All right. Well, good evening, everyone. This is Rob Orsing, Emerging Revolutionary War, kind of keeping in spirit of our 250th series, covering the events as they lead up to the American Revolution. Very happy to have historian J.L. Bell here, who, if you have not followed his website, Boston 1775, go there now, check it out. I read it quite frequently, several times a week. It is the leading source on Revolutionary Boston, the events leading up to the American Revolutionary War, and obviously some events afterwards. JL also has authored Road to Conquer, How Four Stolen Cannon Ignited the Revolutionary War, published by Westholme. A great book, by the way, as well. Please check that out as well. But welcome, JL. How are you doing tonight?
Great. Thanks a lot, Rob.
So we ran into each other back at the Boston Tea Party back in December. Seems like forever ago. And for anyone who was able to be in Boston, the crowds were pretty amazing. So hopefully you all were pretty pleased up there with the turnout.
Oh, yes. I remember I was narrating one of the reenactment events in Old South Meeting House. And during a break, I happened to look behind me out the window down onto the street and realized that the street was just packed with people
Right.
and thought, oh, this is how they got 5,000 people in and around this building in December 1773. They were packed back then, too. We really lucked out. It was a nice, crisp New England
Perfect.
winter. A couple days later, there was a driving rainstorm. And if that had happened during the reenactment, it would have been a really lousy experience. But in fact, it was a terrific experience that a lot of people enjoyed.
Yeah, we were there for 3 days, and that storm you talk about kept us at the airport 15 hours after our flight was supposed to take off. So I remember that storm very, very well. It was a great event. Yourself, everyone involved, did a fantastic event. Set the bar very high for everyone else who's trying to do commemorative events. Um, so I bring that up because I kind of want you to talk a little bit about what happens in Boston after the destruction of the tea, or the more popular, as we call it today, the Tea Party. Um, it's December 1773. How do town officials react there in Boston? How do royal officials react there in Boston to what happened?
Well, right away, you can see in sources like the Diaries of John Adams that the leaders were definitely aware that something would happen, that the British government in London was simply not allow this to stand. And so they were sort of dreading what would be coming as a response. But in the following months, it wasn't like Bostonians decided to be on their best behavior according to the royal standards. There was a very vicious, violent tarring and feathering of a customs official named Captain John Malcolm in January, probably the most violent attack on a single man in the pre-revolutionary period. He was whipped as well as tarred and feathered. There's nearly hanged, and he later reportedly his skin was coming off his back in steaks, strips of flesh. And then in March, another ship arrived in Boston Harbor with more tea, not owned by the East India Company, but bought from them and then sent over to a merchant in Boston, although that merchant had not asked for any. He made very clear in the newspapers. And the word went out from the newspapers, oh, the stations are going to have to do something about this. And that night, all the tea was dumped overboard. So it was like a little encore tea party. And of course, if you're doing the thing again, you're not showing any remorse. You're not saying, "Oh,
Right.
we went too far. We'll never do this again." No, and indeed, when that news of that second Tea Party arrived in Parliament, Lord North used it and said, obviously these people are incorrigible," and that was part of what prompted the British government to come down so hard. It took about 6 weeks for news to travel across the Atlantic. So they received news of the destruction of the tea in early February and immediately started to debate what to do. And the Bostonians knew this schedule, so they knew that anything decided in February, it would take another 6 weeks before it got back to them. So they were just on tenterhooks, waiting to see what was going on, and yet still impeaching the Chief Justice, still destroying tea, still trying to force people not to sell any tea, and as I say, still attacking customs men. So it wasn't like they were basically doing the same thing they had done before, and wondering what sort of trouble it would get them into.
Right. And that you make a great point with that second Tea Party. I'm just gonna use the word Tea Party for easy sake here. Talking about the impact of that, right, is pretty important because, as you know all too well, that's pretty much forgotten about or just kind of skipped over when you read a lot of the more popular histories of this time period, right? They all think, okay, December 73. But you bring up a great point there that maybe that second ship or the second destruction of the tea was really impactful when it was received over in London.
Yes, it had an effect. Now, curiously, nobody, we have all these recollections from elderly men or their descendants about what happened at the Tea Party in December 1773. Nobody left stories about, oh, I wasn't part of the first one, but I was part of the second one, and I should get. Nobody. It's
Right.
all about. I mean, literally, that second Tea Party is totally forgotten, except in the primary sources, because nobody had any stories about it. Now, maybe some of the stories we do have, we believe are about the December event, were actually about the March 1774 event,
Oh
and
wow,
we just
yeah.
don't realize it.
Wow, that's pretty cool. So London hears about it, and we have a lot to cover, so I know we're going to skip over some things more broadly here. Uh, their react you kind of a little bit talked a little bit about the reaction, but kind of go into how the British received this. Well, they're all British, but how the royals received this over in London, and some of the actions they take that we now call the intolerable or coercive acts, which of course separate acts that were passed at separate times. If you kind of go into how they led to those points.
Well, Lord North, the Prime Minister, and his government, the Earl of Dartmouth was Secretary of State for the colonies. Those were the primary policymakers. They had already been dealing, of course, with Boston and Massachusetts as a troublesome spot for a long time. They had worried about other places like the Rhode Island after the Gaspee incident and so on. But Boston and its resistance to revenue laws, to tariffs, to the Customs Department was just notorious. And so they had already been looking at measures advised by Sir Francis Bernard, who was the former royal governor, and to a lesser extent by Thomas Hutchinson, the current royal governor, about curtailing the popular government in Massachusetts, and especially in Boston. And then in late 1773, 1774, things were, there was an attempt to impeach the Chief Justice of Massachusetts, royally appointed, as I said before. There was an attempt to get the governor, Thomas Hutchinson, removed on the basis of letters he and others had sent to London in previous years. And that backfired on the man who leaked those letters to Massachusetts, Benjamin Franklin, as he was held up as a dishonest, treacherous person for leaking the letters. But all that cemented in the minds of Lord North and his government that the Massachusetts patriots, as they would come to be called, the Whigs, were absolutely incorrigible and had to be reined in. And so they had to come up with ways to keep down the possibilities, the potential for unrest and disruption of the government in Massachusetts. And they came up with a series of laws which should be called the coercive acts. That is a term that King George III himself used in a speech to Parliament. So the highest levels of government in Britain used the term coercive acts, and they were meant to coerce better behavior from Massachusetts. The first one was called the Boston Port Bill, and that shut the port of Boston to any sort of trade that involved the Customs Department, starting in June 1774, until the town repaid the cost of the tea destroyed from the East India Company property. And that was, interestingly, that was a temporary. I mean, there at any moment, the Boston could repay that
Right.
cost, or individuals in Boston even suggested that maybe the merchants could get together and repay the cost. It was large; it was over £9,000, but it was still, it was enough borrowing or something. They would be able to do it, but as a part of principle, the town refused to do that. So, although that was a temporary measure, it was never um, the town was never allowed to start trading again under the British Empire. Um, that was enforced by some measures that were not required to go through Parliament. One was the appointment of a new royal governor in place of Thomas Hutchinson, who had already had enough and had been asked to be relieved for quite a while. And the new royal governor was General Thomas Gage, commander in chief of all British soldiers in North America. So, although it was not a military government, it was not, he was not instituting military law. Clearly, when you know, appoint the general in charge of all the troops on the continent to be the governor of one colony, you're coming down on that
Yep.
colony with a bit of military force. And indeed, Parliament sent back into Boston several regiments of army soldiers who had not been stationed in the center of Boston since shortly after the Boston Massacre in 1770. So this was, again, military force didn't have to come through the Parliament because the War Department could send their soldiers anywhere, but it was clearly clamping down on this troublemaking spot of Boston. Then there were a couple more coercive acts. There was a revision of the Quartering Act, which made it easier for the royal government to find barracks for their troops by allowing appointed officials, the governor, the justice of the peace, to commandeer uninhabited buildings, large buildings that would be needed. Now, that act, as it happened, was never invoked in Boston. They found the barracks they needed by renting space or building them. And then the third of the coercive acts was the Act for the Better Administration of Justice in the Province of Massachusetts Bay. The idea there was that the local juries were not trustworthy. So, and there was also still the possibility, which is something they had feared back after the massacre, of a lynching of anybody who had, in this case, was enforcing the new Boston Port Bill. If such a person was grabbed, put under arrest, put on trial in the local court system through the grand jury or something like that, could the crown protect a person who is carrying out crown policy? And so that law said that such a person could be moved to another jurisdiction, basically to Britain, in order to be tried. And so it was taking away, limiting trial by jury in Massachusetts, saying that Massachusetts juries were not trustworthy. Interestingly, of course, Massachusetts was very proud of their juries, and some people were proud of the fact that the British soldiers tried after the Boston Massacre, most of them were acquitted. There was a great deal of push and pull on the question of local juries. This had come up in the Gaspee incident. Again, this law was never invoked in Massachusetts, but it was a big talking point for complaints. So those were the coercive acts that came at the beginning of the news arrived in Massachusetts in spring and early summer. Then the fourth coercive act, which was the one that really tipped things off, was called the Massachusetts Government Act. And that basically rewrote the constitution of the province to limit the bottom-up powers and increase the top-down powers by appointing more officials, including the entire upper house of the legislature, by not allowing towns to have more than one town meeting a year without special permission from the governor. And then there were more reforms, as the London government saw it, in the court system with grand juries and petit juries. And those measures really caused a big response from the locals. And the Massachusetts Government Act arrived in August, so that's when we see a real response. before we go on to the response, I'll just mention that the probably all of us have grown up at one point being told that these four laws were called the coercive acts in Britain, but in America they called them the intolerable acts.
Mhm.
Uh, and in fact, they did call those the intolerable acts in America, but only 100 years later. The earliest time I see that phrase actually being invoked is in American history textbooks in the late 1800s. You can look through the founding fathers' papers, you can look through the newspapers of the time, and the phrase intolerable acts just doesn't appear, which was a real surprise to me. I'm trying to use the word coercive acts more often because that is definitely a period term, an official term. Uh, like the Boston Tea Party, the intolerable acts is a term that, yeah, it's not a period term. It came up later. It has a
Right.
certain resonance now, but it's good to know that it wasn't the actual term at the time. If you went up to Samuel Adams and asked about the intolerable acts, capital I, capital A, he wouldn't know what you were talking about.
It's interesting that you talk about that. So I was debating with a colleague of mine today about which one of these four really hit home, and they were arguing the Port Act. I was like, well, it hurt, but they could have paid that and ended that. It sounds like, and I agree with you. It's this last one that really, because it changes the whole dynamic of how people in Massachusetts have been operating for over a century. The town meeting, as you mentioned, is such an essential part of the culture, and you're just totally changing how they're able to operate. I think to
Yeah,
me, that's probably the biggest. What do you think?
I certainly agree. I mean, it's not just that the Port Act was temporary and they could have done something. It was also
Right.
that by closing the port of Boston, well, that did increase business in the port of Salem and Marblehead. So maybe Salem and Marblehead, the merchants there might not have been so eager to end the Boston Port Bill. It had very little effect on a farmer out in Holliston or further out in Bridgewater or something. I mean, it really was focused on Boston and its maritime economy. Whereas the Massachusetts Government Act was going to affect, I mean, it was literally going to affect how that, if a farmer in Holliston was having trouble with, runaway pigs from his neighbor and he wanted to have a better hog reeve in town or something like that, he would not be able to call a town meeting
Right.
until March. And just because, I mean, even if he was supportive of the royal government, that was cutting down on his ability to govern himself. And even if he was neutral, he was getting punished for something he had nothing to do with because Holliston was not, or what these other small towns were not, tarring and feathering customs men. They didn't have any customs men.
Right.
Even if some of those towns had expressed support for what Boston had been doing in previous years, they were not directly involved. And so the Massachusetts Government Act, well, at one time it had quote unquote reforms that many royal officials had been pushing for a while. It was really a step too far. And it is notable that it arrived in Boston, or sorry, in Salem, of course, in Salem, because Boston's port was closed. It arrived in Salem in early August 1774, and within a month, there had been a revolution out in the countryside. A revolution in which nobody died, but nevertheless a complete change of government in just 1 month.
Wow. And it's amazing too. You talk about, I'm glad you pointed out the date of that because, here in Virginia, we just commemorated some things here that happened, dissolution of the Virginia House of Burgesses in reaction to word of some of these acts being passed. And you read these resolutions, it's about the port. It's not about the change of the Massachusetts government system. They're angered already about what's happening, and then they were already starting to move toward calling for uh, a Continental Congress. And
Yes,
so,
and the Massachusetts Whigs were sort of worried in that not only in the first part of 1774 about what London would do, but also how other Americans would react,
right,
and would they come to support Boston, or would they see what the Bostonians had done with the destruction of the tea as too rowdy, too law breaking, And indeed, I mean, people like George Washington were not very supportive of the destruction of the tea, but the Boston Port Act was seen as going too far, and that uh, those acts by the Virginia House of Burgesses were a very important sign of support for Boston. That was very encouraging for the Boston Whigs. When the Provincetown meeting and then later the Virginia House called for a Continental Congress, that was a big sign of support. And the Massachusetts House, which was at the time sort of in a tussle with the new royal governor about whether they had to move out to Salem as another way of punishing Boston, they did a few maneuvers to put together a plan to send men to the Continental Congress. They got a loyalist who was out of town to make sure that he couldn't tell the royal governor what was going on, and then they had a closed door session, literally closing the door to vote for Continental Congress delegates. And the royal secretary, Gage's, I think third in command of the government, was outside the door reading Governor Gage's order dissolving the legislature while the door was locked. And Samuel Adams just kept the door locked until they were done, and then they opened the door and said, "Oh, now we're dissolved." And so Massachusetts was fully participating, glad to have that first Continental Congress. When it arrived, of course, they were not quite sure how far it would go, what sort of support it would offer. But by that point, that was in September when the Continental Congress started, things had changed so much on the ground.
Right. And before we jump into that and some of the things that you might want to talk about between the Continental Congress and the arrival of these acts, how was Gage received in Boston originally before that last coercive act came through? How was he received?
When Gage arrived in May 1774, he was, at first, people thought he might be a breath of fresh air. People had really soured on Governor Thomas Hutchinson because of those letters, because of his response to the tea crisis, his absolute stubbornness about letting the tea ships leave, and other things. So they were sort of the opinion that anybody could be better than Thomas Hutchinson. Then the fact that Governor Gage was arriving with a whole bunch of troops, well, that was not a good sign. But on the other hand, it was harder to complain about that when you've got soldiers all over the place. There was an attempt to show support for Gage in a sort of patriotic fashion, respecting the office, respecting the system of royal government, respecting the king that he represented. So that, for instance, John Hancock made sure to have his militia company, the Company of Cadets, come out and be an honor guard for the new governor. Very quickly, however, it turned out that if you were signing an address welcoming the new royal governor or thanking the old royal governor, Hutchinson, as he left, signing those addresses became a litmus test to whether you were going to be a patriot or a loyalist. And some people, you can see in the newspapers, as soon as the addresses are published with the lists of signatures underneath, there are a few men who say, "Oh, I didn't realize that this was a problem. I'm sorry. I take it all back." And then there are others who are literally, losing their militia posts, losing their posts as town officials, and that really was a dividing line that Gage did not expect. He very quickly moved his seat of governing to Salem, north of Boston, as the biggest port still open, and he started to he convened the legislature there. He had soldiers there. Salem did have a set of loyalists who were sort of advising him. He rented a house in Danvers nearby. And so he was for a while in a sort of comfortable situation away from Boston. But within a few months, he realized that where he was no more comfortable than anywhere else, and went back to Boston, where most of the troops were. Interestingly, the house that he rented in Danvers is still standing, but it's standing in the Washington, D.C. neighborhood of Kalorama.
Mhm.
In the 1930s, it was dismantled, moved to Washington, D.C., and put back up under the supervision of experts from colonial Williamsburg. So the oldest house in Washington, D.C. is actually the house that General Gage stayed in when he was governor of a different state.
I was glad you brought that up, because that's the one little thing I knew about Danvers and in this time period with Gage. And I bet you 99% of our audience didn't know that, because that's a little known fact. I mean, I lived in Washington, D.C. my whole life, and no one really talks about that. So it's
Yeah, well,
thank you
it's not
for
a
bringing that up.
historic site, or it's not a tourist site. It's a privately owned house. It
Mhm.
just happens to be very old.
That's great. So Gage arrives in May. Let's talk about that summer. We've already touched on the Continental Congress a little bit, but what are the events that you like to highlight that happened during this summer time period? Is there a lot going on in Boston, or is it just kind of reacting to these coercive acts that are slowly arriving from across the Atlantic?
Boston is sort of subdued, partly because they have so many, or they had so many soldiers in town that they really couldn't do public protests. The legislature had been dissolved, so there was not really a channel for protest. So they would have town meetings. They discovered that although they were not allowed to have new town meetings under the Massachusetts Government Act later, they could simply adjourn their meeting from one day to the next. So it was never a new town meeting. It was just a continuation of an old town meeting. There were also out in the countryside. One of the things I've talked about, how Massachusetts was worried whether the other colonists would support them. Well, the people in Boston were worried about whether the countryside would support them. But out in the countryside, in the middle of the summer of 1774, uh, people began to get organized, and they organized around county conventions, which had never been held before. They organized in committees of correspondence, which Boston had encouraged, and these were sort of standing committees of the town meeting that would keep in touch with other towns, especially with Boston, with the legislature, and try to make sure that, well, officially they were communications committees, but they really did organize boycotts, they organized protests. And then towards the end of July, the county courts began to be meeting in different parts of the province. And with word of the Massachusetts Government Act arriving, these uh, crowds would show up, hundreds of people, thousands of people at times, men coming in their militia companies from their towns, massing around the courthouses, refusing to let the justices of the peace and the other judges have county court sessions under the new Massachusetts Government Act. And that was the first overt act of resistance, saying, this law is so unconstitutional, we'll simply not allow it to take place. And all that protest movement started in the western part of the colony in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, which was the county seat at the time. And so there was no better sign at that moment that the rural parts of Massachusetts were going to support Boston. We're going to come out against the Massachusetts Government Act as strongly or stronger than Boston itself could when it was under military occupation.
Yeah, it's as you said, and you kind of said this to us years ago when we had you on another podcast about the thought is revolution is born in Boston. It's just Bostonians, but as you just pointed out, it's really those communities outside of Boston that really have a little bit more freedom to organize because the troops aren't there and because there's not as many British royal influences out in those areas that there were in Boston, and I
Yeah,
think that's overlooked a lot.
the population of Massachusetts, I mean, it was a rural society still, so it was still 95% farmers. 95 or more percent Congregationalist. You went to, these small rural towns, there was one meeting house, and you went there. And so it was what in agriculture would be a monoculture. It was all wheat. And this idea that we have to resist the Massachusetts Government Act and these other coercive acts just sort of swept across the countryside like some sort of blight from the London point of view. And suddenly everybody was infected with this idea that we cannot let these laws stand. We have to go in our militia companies, not bringing our guns, but bringing all our friends and relatives and stand outside the court's house and make sure that the government is shut down.
Mhm. So let's go into the Continental Congress just briefly. Don't want you to have to focus too much on that because there's a lot that happens that fall and winter in Massachusetts, but there's a lot of debate on who calls for this Congress first, right? We know down here in Virginia, they get word in Williamsburg on May 30th from Annapolis that there are some colonies calling for a Congress, and then the Virginia delegates who are still in Williamsburg meet again in Peyton Randolph's house and sign on to this idea. But is it Boston? Is it Massachusetts who's calling for that, or is it just something that's just kind of melds?
I don't think Massachusetts. You can find a Massachusetts or Boston explicit call for that.
Right.
I think the first suggestion comes from Providence town meeting, and then from other groups in other colonies, but the Virginia Burgesses' decision to call for this was extremely important because Virginia was by far the largest colony. It was the oldest colony. It was a wealthy one. It had a lot of influence. And furthermore, that was, I think, the first official colony-wide body to call for such a meeting. It was the first body that could actually claim the authority to send people to a Continental Congress. Now, of course, there were a couple of antecedents for this. There was the Albany Congress of 1754, encouraged by Benjamin Franklin. There was the Stamp Act Congress of 1765. So the idea of a Continental Congress was not entirely new, but nevertheless, considering how little had been accomplished by those previous two Congresses, it was a pretty bold step to even try this again. And again, Massachusetts was wondering, okay, how many? What will the response from our fellow colonies be? They were pretty certain that New Englanders would be on their side, but there was a real problem. New England and which was at the time New Hampshire, Massachusetts, included Maine, Rhode Island, and Connecticut. It was seen as a weird part of the British Empire, this part founded by Puritans, still somewhat puritanical in its laws. For instance, you were not allowed to travel from one town to another on a Sunday in New England. These laws that were not in effect anywhere else in the British Empire. The religious establishment being these independent or Congregationalist churches that did not have that sway anywhere else in the British Empire. It was a really weird little place, and so there was always the possibility that the other colonies with different religious traditions, different types of government. All the colonies outside of New England already had appointed councils. So it was quite possible that Virginia could look and say, so Massachusetts is going to have an appointed council, big deal.
Right.
And instead, they did respond to the Boston Port Bill with this Continental Congress. Then, of course, at the Continental Congress, there's a question of, okay, how strongly will they support, what sort of resolutions, what sort of messages will they issue? And it's notable that some of the earliest things that the Massachusetts delegates did, one of them was there was a question of who should offer prayers for the Congress. And somebody suggested a man named the Reverend Jacob Duché. And he was an Anglican. And the question was, okay, is he going to be acceptable to everybody? And Samuel Adams got up and said, he's heard very good things about this man. Certainly he would be acceptable. And if Samuel Adams, this old Puritan, was willing to say that, that was a big sign. I mean, this is really a very canny move on the Adams cousins' part. There's another moment during the Continental Congress where they suddenly find themselves, the Massachusetts delegates found themselves in a room with a bunch of Quakers and Baptists, all wanting to know why are you oppressing minority religions in New England, and they have to do a lot of fast talking to say, no, we don't really do that, because they really did.
Yeah.
And they were seeing the fault lines. They were seeing what divided New England society from the other colonies. And out of that, and other factors, we got eventually a sense of federal religious freedom, 15 years later, or more, in the First Amendment, um, in because Massachusetts and New England realized they needed the support of these other colonies that did not have their same social roots.
So, from the point of Massachusetts, what did they want to get out of the First Continental Congress? From the, like I said, the point of view of the men from Massachusetts that attend this Congress, each colony has a different thought about what should be accomplished. What did they want to accomplish?
They
We've all seen the John Adams HBO miniseries, right? We all know that, but like, what actually did they want to accomplish from this first Congress?
they wanted a show of unity, a sort of everyone standing firm against these new acts. The Massachusetts Government Act had just arrived in, as I say, in early August, as the delegation had already been chosen. They were already preparing to go, but they were coming with this new news. So that law had not been part of the decision to have the Congress, but now it was yet another thing that this Congress is going to have to respond to, and they really wanted, as I say, a show of unity and firmness. There was still a feeling in the American political class that if we just keep showing higher and higher levels of the British government that we are opposed on good constitutional grounds to these new laws, that at some point, some higher level will realize these were big mistakes. We should pull back. And at this point, with Lord North, the prime minister, pushing through these laws, the only higher level of government was the king himself. And that's what they were hoping to convince. In addition, there was a parliamentary election in late 1774. It was the timing was not would not allow any Congress resolutions to arrive before the vote there, but there was some hope in America that there would be a change in the electorate in Britain and a new government without Lord North in charge, somebody who would be more amenable and understanding the way there had been back after the Stamp Act in 1765. And as it turned out, Lord North won a very big majority again and continued to be prime minister for several more years.
Mm-hmm. So the Continental Congress meets there in Philadelphia on September 5th. Well, it begins in September 5th, 74. Takes a little time to get enough members to arrive there at Carpenter's Hall in Philadelphia. But something happens on September 1st there
Yes.
in
I mean,
Massachusetts. That's a really big thing. If you can talk a little bit about that.
and it changes the way things are going. And we hear the first thing the Continental Congress hears about, and shortly after they start meeting, is quote unquote the bombardment of Boston.
Right.
Well, that's not something that you can actually find in history books, but they did hear about that. Now, what happened was on September 1st, General Thomas Gage, the governor, decided to take his first steps. He had been sort of pushed out of Salem. He took his first steps to take control of a supply of gunpowder that belonged to the Massachusetts militia and was stored across the Charles River from Boston in Charlestown in a gunpowder storage house that was owned by the province. Now, as governor, Gage was the commander-in-chief of the militia. He had every right under both the new laws and the old Constitution to order militia supplies wherever they wanted. So, so it wasn't that he was breaking any law by doing this, but he sent soldiers, regular soldiers, out to Charlestown to collect that gunpowder and bring it back to Castle Island and to under the control of Gage and his military. He sent some more soldiers to Cambridge, next to Charlestown, to confiscate and bring back a couple of small cannon that the militia used for training. And this operation, which took a few hundred soldiers early in the morning of September 1st, well, as it was reported, as the rumors spread from Charlestown and Cambridge, the rumors got worse and worse, so that people were talking about how there had been a second Boston massacre, that people in Cambridge had tried to resist the removal of the cannon and had been shot by the soldiers. And then that got worse and worse. And so within a few days later, when the news got to central Massachusetts, literally people were saying that the soldiers had fired on the people of Boston, and the Royal Navy in the harbor had fired on the people of Boston, and the town was in flames. And clearly this was Great Oppression. Everybody's favorite Continental Army soldier, Joseph Plum Martin, wrote in his memoirs about, and he's a young teenager at the time, about going to bed after hearing on the Sabbath about the British soldiers attacking Boston, and going to bed and hearing a wagon on the road outside, thinking, oh, the soldiers are coming here, and waking up and realizing that no, actually he was perfectly safe. But that's how far these dire rumors had gotten within a few days. As a response to the early dire rumors, on the 2nd of September, the day after the powder was confiscated, thousands of militiamen from eastern Massachusetts began to stream into Cambridge, and they had come with the idea that there had been some attack by the British military. Pretty soon they realized that that wasn't the case, but they decided to do what locals in other communities had been doing for the past couple of weeks, which is to seek out the men who had been appointed to the council, to the upper house of the legislature under the new Massachusetts Government Act, and require them by, well, shall we say, consensus? The 5,000 people demanding their resignation from this new body under the, so they did that. They got the two council members in Cambridge to resign. They got the sheriff who had helped to remove the cannon to apologize. They got the local county clerk to declare that he would not do any more work under the Massachusetts Government Act. And then the new lieutenant governor, just appointed 3 weeks before, he had been actually gone into Boston to try to convince General Gage not to try to break up this gathering, uprising with troops. And he came back to Cambridge after successfully doing this, and they insisted that he resign at some level as well. And he tried to resist, and the day ended with 4,000 or 5,000 men ringing his house in Cambridge, pounding on the windows, causing his children upstairs to cry, and demanding that he sign a resignation, which he signed. My house surrounded by 4,000 people, I hereby put my name, Thomas Oliver. And then he immediately went into Boston for protection. In that moment, there were a few other things that happened, incidents, which all added up to the realization on both sides that General Gage's authority as the royal governor, the ability for him to say, I am the representative of the king, I have powers granted to me by Parliament, so you must do what I say under the law, that authority stopped at the gates of Boston. The rural part of Massachusetts was no longer obeying him. And in fact, and this was something why the Boston Whigs were so worried and went out to try to calm the situation in Cambridge, the rural population was now more militant, more angry, more willing to march than Boston, which of course still had, at this point, a couple thousand troops quartered among them. Then it also became clear on that day that whatever solution was going to come out of this crisis between Boston, Massachusetts, and the Crown, it was going to have a military component. Maybe there wouldn't be fighting, but part of showing the firmness and unity and the resistance was going to be uh, developing enough of a military force to make that clear to the other side. So both sides almost immediately started to grab military supplies like gunpowder, like cannon and artillery pieces. Within a short time, there would be more military drills, militia drills. The Massachusetts Provincial Congress was organized in October, and they quickly took control of the militia outside of Boston. They started to collect the taxes to pay for the militia and to pay for new armaments and to pay for gunpowder. And so within 2 months of the Massachusetts Government Act arriving in Salem and starting to be implemented, there was literally a shadow government with a shadow military developing out in the countryside.
Yeah, and I think Gage had. You think? Well, I think. But I would like to know what you think. Do you think Gage is totally surprised by the reaction to his troops getting the powder? I mean, he had to have been like, oh my God, thousands of people turning out, and this is the world before social media, right? So
Yeah.
the network that the Whigs had created through the countryside was pretty extensive to be able to get all those, get the story out, right? But then also to call everyone in. He had to have been just completely surprised.
Yes, I mean, that is the New England militia system in action, and we can see that happening at other times, like the fall of Fort Edward earlier in the last war and the Lexington alarm, where uh, the news spreads, and without really knowing what was going on, but knowing that something was terrible, people began. Men went for their guns, gathered with their neighbors, and started to march. And indeed, it was quite surprising to Gage. He did not expect that, partly because he felt he was in the right. He had, in fact, been alerted by a general in the militia about this powder. That general had to skedaddle out of Cambridge before the crowd found him. Um, so, but within a couple of days of the powder alarm, as historians have called it, that's another term which was not used at the time, but we'll use it. Within a couple of days of the powder alarm, um, Gage realized that he's a military man. He put cannon at the gate of Boston, pointing out at the countryside. He ordered all the troops in Quebec to come to Boston. He started ordering all the troops in New York to come to Boston, and he started to alert his supervisors in London that this was a real crisis and that they should be prepared for this. And so, yes, he was surprised. At the same time, he reacted more strongly, more forcibly than anybody else, and he ended up failing to convince the Lord North and the Earl of Dartmouth and the Secretary of War, Viscount Barrington, that they needed to really take this very seriously. The loyalists and the royal governors and the government in London had all sort of operated on the idea that there was just this thin layer of resistance at the top of society. If you could just peel off those troublemakers, then the vast amount of fraction of the populace, the great majority, was going to be loyal and peaceable. And when you have 5,000 people massing overnight, demanding the resignation of all royal officials in town, suddenly, for somebody who's close by, like Gage, you realize, no, it's not just this layer of troublemakers. It's not just Boston. It is a serious, serious opposition.
Right, and I'm going to paraphrase, and don't I know I'm going to get this wrong, John, but there's the great letter that Gage sends back. If you think 1,000 men's enough, send 10,000. If you think 10,000 is not enough, send more. So he's trying to really kind of show the officials back in London that the situation is much worse than they had anticipated.
That's right. And he was suggesting things like, okay, there's no way we're going to be able to enforce some of these coercive acts. We should suspend them, get our act together, beef up the military, and then try to enforce them. And Lord North actually went to former Governor Hutchinson and said, "What does this mean? You can't suspend an act of Parliament." He just could not believe what he was being told. So he got the message. He just didn't believe it. And Gage was just not getting the support he felt he needed in order to carry out the policies that he was being tasked with carrying out.
And so you start seeing some of these towns around New England start to protect their powder, right? Or worried about British regulars taking their powder. So I'm kind of fast forwarding us into December, up at Fort
Yes.
William Mary. If you can kind of give us a little back, because I think when I was researching about this years ago, it's something that I think people don't talk enough about when they're talking about the lead up to the American Revolution. Paul Revere's there, right? So the lead up here to Fort William Mary up in New Hampshire. Talk a little bit about what happens up there in December 14th, December 15th, 1774.
Okay, I'm going to take a running leap at this because we can
Okay.
start back on September 2nd, and you can see in town records that immediately after the powder alarm, towns start, as you say, to look and say, okay, do we have enough gunpowder? Do we have enough flints? And then in October, the Massachusetts Provincial Congress convenes. Basically, it's the lower house of the legislature without the authority of the royal government, and they very quickly decide to take control of the military. And since they're not an official body, they cannot require towns to do things, but they suggest very strongly that the towns get together in their militia companies and make sure that their officers are loyal. And so there's a bit of a purge of loyalist officers. During this time, there's also a secret, what I call arms race, where towns and different factions try to grab control of any artillery pieces that they have. So the port towns like Charlestown, Salem, Plymouth, they make sure that the cannon in the batteries which are guarding the harbor are pulled back into in the town and gotten ready for battlefield use. There's purchasing of cannon from merchants who had them left over from the past wars. And all these guns are being moved out into the countryside away from the British Army and its power and prepared for use on the battlefield. It's a slow process, it's an expensive process, so it's not quite done. And that's why we don't hear about these cannon for quite a while. One of the moments in this arms race was a rumor went around Boston that a Royal Navy ship was being prepared to go north. And there was thought that perhaps it was going to Fort William and Mary in the harbor of Portsmouth, New Hampshire, on the border of Maine. And the ship would take control of the cannons, gunpowder, and fortified position there. And so the Boston Whigs put together a message with, yes, their major courier at the time, Paul Revere, a silversmith, who in a little wagon rode up in December 1774 to Portsmouth and Exeter, New Hampshire. It's always said that he was on icy roads. I haven't checked the weather reports, but this was actually, in some ways, it was a longer and more difficult ride than his ride in April 1775.
Sure, right.
And he went and alerted the local militia in Exeter, New Hampshire, next to Portsmouth, and they got together. They decided what to do, and then that night, middle of December, 1774, they stormed the fort. And there is a report from the British officer in charge of the fort. Now, he was a low-level officer, and he had only 6 soldiers, so it wasn't like it was a huge bastion of defensiveness. But he said that he actually fired a cannon at these men. So you have a militia group on one, a militia unit or companies on one side, and regular army firing cannon on the other side. The militia group storms into the fort. They take control. They pull down the royal flag. They take all the I think all the gunpowder away that first night. So you have armed militia, armed military units on each side, territory changing hands, military ordnance changing hands. That looks an awful lot like a war, except that nobody was killed and nobody was wounded. So if there had been actual casualties there and they had actually started the war, well, the story of the war would not be, oh, innocent farmers who happen to be out on their town green at dawn with their guns being mercilessly fired upon by regular army troops, which is the story that the Patriots were able to tell about Lexington. It would have been that a rowdy group of militiamen at night stormed one of His Majesty's forts and took over from the regular army and stole military supplies, which would not have been such a stirring story of innocence, and the bad guys would have been much less clear on that story. And in fact, a couple days later, after the first storming of Fort William and Mary, a couple of the New Hampshire delegates to the First Continental Congress showed up in Exeter and sort of took stock of the situation. And the authority was here, and they decided, okay, we're going back in, and we're going to take all the cannon and cannonballs as well. So again, it was like the Second Boston Tea Party. There was not any sense of remorse. There was not any sense that, oh, we went too far. They hadn't gone far enough, and they went, and all that ordnance, that gunpowder, it was said to have been used later at the Battle of Bunker Hill and others. So that was New Hampshire beefing up its military power at the expense of the Royal military.
And just real quick, what's the reaction in Massachusetts to that? Because you make a good point, right? It's the militia going in and attacking regular troops. The king's troops are being attacked. They could have lost the PR battle with this. They didn't, obviously. But what was the reaction in Massachusetts to hearing about the events up near Portsmouth?
That's a good question. I believe that they were, because there were no casualties, because it was simply a matter of taking control of military supplies, which they could argue really should belong to us anyway. I think they saw it as a great success, and certainly it was a sign that that part of New Hampshire was strongly behind them and was working well with the Massachusetts Provincial Congress. As it was becoming beefing up its own preparations for a possible war in the spring.
And as we start to close down here a little bit, as you pointed out, things just seem to the whole point of having this discussion with you is trying to show people how events just kind of just domino in this going toward revolution and open warfare. Of all the events you've talked about, and I know this is an impossible question to answer, but I kind of want you to leave our viewers with the sense of what's the one thing you think people should study more about this period to try to understand how these events dominoed into April 19th, 1775.
I guess I would say that it's the Massachusetts Government Act, followed by the Powder Alarm and the other uprisings in the colony at that time. That it was the Massachusetts Government Act really went farther than the other coercive acts, and really got to the question of self-government. And the response to it was, as I say, the first. It was a widespread popular response, not just in Boston, and it had a military component to it as men mobilized in their militia units and were ready, at first bringing their guns to do armed rebellion. So at that point, there would have been. It was easy to imagine circumstances which would have led to a war in early September 1774 over this new law, and it was only because there was not great resistance on the part of the royal authorities, because they didn't have the force and they didn't realize what was happening, that the situation on those days resolved as peacefully as it did.
So my last question for you, to let you go for this evening, any projects that you're working on right now that you'd like to talk about? I know you're always researching.
I'm always researching. I have an idea for another book which would take up the story of the American artillery the day after the Battle of Lexington and Concord, starting in April 20th, as the Massachusetts Army starts to move those guns that they had collected around Boston, and very quickly realizes that these are quite inadequate. and then after the Battle of Bunker Hill, realizes that their artillery commander is not quite up to the job either, and eventually the outcome of all that story is a new military commander under General Washington, a man who has never had any military experience at all, but has a great sense of logistics and a great sense of leading people and organizing. That's Henry Knox.
Right. That's great.
and
Yeah.
and it's I think the story of Knox bringing cannon down from Lake Champlain has been told a lot. It is a stirring story. I think some of it can be exaggerated, some of it not. But I think the political story of how he got to that point is just as interesting and has a lot of players, a lot of what if ways things could have gone differently. There was a moment when he was chosen to be the second in command of the artillery regiment, and he turned it down. He was rather adept at politics, even as a young man, and that was the beginning of a 20-year relationship with George Washington. That So it is a story with a lot of different dimensions. Before I can get to writing that, there are all sorts of little stories that
Of
grab my
course.
attention on the way, and so I don't know if I'll ever make it, but I give it a
Well,
shot.
well, I think that story is just as interesting as moving the cannon because people, as you said, no military experience, and here he is doing this feat that's been, well documented, commemorated. So I think telling how he got to that position is pretty important. And you're going to be super busy. I just know people are going to be asking you for talks and lectures, and between now and this time next year. So I hope you find the time to dig into that research because I think it'd be definitely a worthwhile book to the historiography of that time period. Um,
Well,
well,
thank you,
I
Rob.
want, yeah, no, I want to thank you. I want to thank JL Bell for joining us tonight. For those who are watching live or listen on Spotify or watch later, I think you just know that JL knows more about this than anybody out there, and he's very humble about that. But I think you learned hopefully a lot tonight about how the events in Massachusetts really fast forwarded. And then obviously we'll worry about the spring of '75 a different time. So thanks again for joining us.